Story 1. The Hessian Hollowing. The weight of a warning. The summer of 1990 was thick with humidity and the drone of cicadas when Jake Miller, 22 years old and built like a lumberjack, made the decision that would haunt him for decades. His grandfather, a wiry man named Elias who had worked the coal mines of Pennsylvania for 40 years, sat on their front porch in Potter County, whittling a piece of pine. The wood chips fell like snowflakes onto the warped floorboards. "You're going into Dutchman's Hollow," Elias said. It wasn't a question. The old man's eyes, pale blue and clouded with early cataracts, seemed to look through Jake and into the dark tree line beyond the gravel road. "Don't," Jake's friend Tom, waiting in a rusted Ford F-150 idling in the driveway, revved the engine impatiently. Jake shrugged, offering the same explanation he'd given all week. "It's the only section of the map that's blank, Grandpa. We want to see something no one else has seen." Elias stopped whittling. He set the knife down with a deliberate slowness that made the hair on Jake's arms stand up. "There's a reason it's blank, boy. My daddy told me, and his daddy told him, that the hollow ain't empty. It's full of something that's been there since the Hessians came through." Jake had heard the stories. Hessian deserters from the Revolutionary War, fleeing Washington's crossing of the Delaware, supposedly wandered north and west, disappearing into the endless woods of Pennsylvania. Some said they settled there, intermarried with Lenape women, and went feral. Others said they found something in the deep forest, something that wasn't human, and became part of it. Jake had always dismissed these tales as the ramblings of old men who feared the dark. "Grandpa, that was over 200 years ago. If there was anything there, it's long gone." Elias picked up his whittling again, but his hands trembled. "Things like that don't leave, Jake. They just get hungrier." Into the hollow. The Susquehannock State Forest is a sprawling green ocean of hardwood and pine, covering over 265,000 acres of mountainous terrain. Dutchman's Hollow wasn't on any official map because it wasn't a maintained trail. It was a geological scar, a steep ravine carved by a forgotten creek, accessible only by bushwhacking through dense undergrowth. Jake and Tom parked at the end of a logging road and began their descent around noon. The forest changed as they went deeper. The sunlight, which had been bright and golden, fractured into thin, dusty beams that seemed to lose their warmth. The air grew cooler, damper, and carried the smell of wet moss and decay. Tom, usually a talkative guy who cracked jokes about everything, fell silent. His eyes darted from side to side, scanning the spaces between the trees. "Dude," Tom whispered, his voice unnaturally loud in the stillness. "You feel that? Like someone's watching us?" Jake felt it too. It was a primal sensation, the kind that makes your hindbrain scream predator. But he shook his head, attributing it to the oppressive silence. "It's just the woods. No birds, no squirrels. That's what's weird." They continued for another hour, following the creek bed, until they stumbled upon the cairn. It was a pile of stones, each the size of a human head, stacked in a crude pyramid about 4 feet high. The stones were covered in greenish-black lichen, indicating they'd been there for decades, if not longer. "Holy shit," Tom breathed, approaching it. "Look at this." At the base of the cairn, partially buried in mud and pine needles, was a small tobacco tin. The kind that men used 100 years ago. Tom pried it open with his pocket knife. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, was a single piece of paper, yellowed and brittle. Written in faded ink was a single word, Hess. The temperature dropped. Jake felt it as a physical wall of cold air that pushed against him. The hair on his neck stood straight up. He turned, slowly, and looked into the trees. It was standing about 50 yards away, partially obscured by the trunk of a massive oak. At first, Jake thought it was a man, a very tall, very thin man. But as his eyes adjusted, the proportions became wrong. Its limbs were too long, its torso too narrow. It was pale, so pale it seemed to glow faintly in the dim light, and completely naked. Its head was hairless, elongated, and its face. Jake couldn't process the face. It had eyes, but they were deep, dark pits that seemed to swallow the light. It wasn't looking at them. It was looking through them. "Run!" Tom gasped. He didn't have to say it twice. They crashed through the undergrowth, branches tearing at their clothes and skin, not daring to look back. They ran until their lungs burned, until they burst out of the tree line and onto the logging road, collapsing against the ford in heaving, terrified gasps. The locket. Jake tried to forget. He moved to Philadelphia, got a job, started a life. But the image of that pale thing haunted his dreams. 10 years later, in 2000, he returned to Potter County for his grandfather's funeral. After the service, standing in the cemetery as the November wind stripped the last leaves from the oaks, his cousin Sarah approached him. "I'm going into the hollow," she said. She was a grad student in folklore, studying Appalachian mythology. "I want to see those cairns you talked about." Jake argued. He pleaded. He told her everything, every detail he'd suppressed for a decade. Sarah listened patiently, then smiled. "Jake, it was probably a deer, or a stressed-out hiker. The mind plays tricks in the deep woods." He couldn't let her go alone. So, against every instinct screaming in his skull, he went back. The hollow was exactly as he remembered it. The same oppressive silence, the same fractured light. But the cairns had changed. There were more of them now, dozens, arranged in a rough triangle around a stone foundation Jake hadn't noticed before. It was the remnants of an old cabin, fire-blackened and collapsing. Sarah, fascinated, began taking photos. As she circled the foundation, her boot struck something metallic. She bent down and pulled a silver locket from the mud. It was tarnished, but intricate, Victorian era, maybe older. She opened it. Inside was a tiny, faded photograph of a young woman with dark eyes. The locket felt wrong in Jake's hands. It was unnaturally heavy, as if it were filled with lead. The hum started low, a vibration that Jake felt in his molars. It rose in pitch, becoming a drone that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The air thickened, pressing against them. And then Jake saw it again. The same pale figure, but it wasn't alone. Behind it, deeper in the trees, there were more, a dozen at least, standing in a loose semicircle, watching. They hadn't moved, but they were closer. Much closer. The locket in Jake's hand grew cold, bitingly cold, and he dropped it. It hit a rock and snapped shut. The sound was like a gunshot in the silence, and every single pale head turned toward them in unison. They ran. They ran like they were 10 years younger, like the hounds of hell were at their heels. Jake lost his camera somewhere in the brush. Sarah stumbled, screamed, and kept going. They didn't stop until they reached the truck. The legacy. Back at the house, Sarah was shaken but alive. The next day, she dove into local archives. What she found chilled Jake to the bone. 2 families, the Van der Heides and the Macduffs, had indeed settled near the hollow in the late 1600s. By 1806, they had vanished from all records, but their names appeared in local folklore as the Hollow Ones, people who went into the ground and came back wrong. Then there was the case of Raymond Hess. In 1977, a logger from Renovo went missing for 3 days. When he was found wandering a fire road, he was emaciated, dehydrated, and completely insane. He muttered constantly about the ones in the ground and the stone piles. He was admitted to a mental hospital, escaped in 1979, and was never seen again. In his cell, scratched into the wall, was the word Hess. Jake researched further. Since the 1970s, at least a dozen hikers had gone missing in that section of the Susquehannock. Their cases remained unsolved. Locals, when pressed, would only say, "Stay out of the hollow." They're still hungry. The stone cairns, Jake realized, weren't trail markers. They were warnings. Or perhaps, they were feeders, absorbing the life force of the land to sustain the things that lived beneath. The Hessian deserters hadn't just found something in the woods. They had become part of it, their humanity hollowed out, replaced by an eternal, patient hunger. And they were still waiting, deep in the hollow, for anyone foolish enough to wander into their territory. Jake still has nightmares. In them, he's standing in the clearing, surrounded by pale figures, and he can feel the weight of the locket in his hand, pulling him down into the cold, dark earth. Story 2. The Willow River Stalker. The Hunter's Instinct. November 2016. The Minnesota deer season was in full swing, and the woods near Willow River were filled with orange-clad hunters. One of them, a man who would later use the online handle Inquisitor 4196, was a seasoned outdoorsman. He'd been hunting these woods since he was a boy, knew every trail, every ridge, every deer path. He considered himself immune to the fear of the dark, to the irrational panic that seized city folk when the sun went down. He was wrong. It was late afternoon, the golden hour when the light slants through the trees and paints everything in shades of amber and shadow. He was walking a familiar deer trail, moving slowly, his eyes scanning for sign. The woods were quiet, too quiet. He'd noticed it an hour ago. The birds had stopped singing. The squirrels had stopped chattering. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. He rounded a bend in the trail and froze. About 40 yards ahead, partially concealed by the trunk of a massive white pine, was an animal. At first glance, his hunter's brain filed it as a deer. It had the general shape, the tawny brown coloration, the stillness of a browsing herbivore. But something was wrong. It was standing on its hind legs, one foreleg braced against the tree trunk as if for support. He raised his binoculars, his heart beginning to pound a slow, heavy rhythm against his ribs. It wasn't a deer. The thing was emaciated, painfully thin, with ribs visible beneath a hide that was patchy and covered in what looked like matted, disease-ridden fur. Its hind legs were jointed like a deer's, but elongated, almost human in their proportions. Its forelegs, or arms, were impossibly long, ending in hands. No, not hands, but something close. Fingers, long and thin, tipped with what looked like dark, curved claws, dug into the bark of the pine. But it was the head that made his blood run cold. The skull was elongated, more like a canine than a deer, but the face was flat, almost simian. Its ears were large and pointed, swiveling independently, tracking sounds he couldn't hear. And its eyes, they were large, dark, and set too far forward on its skull. Prey animals have eyes on the sides of their heads to watch for predators. Predators have eyes in the front, for depth perception, for the hunt. These were predators' eyes, and they were fixed on him. The stare. For a long, agonizing moment, neither of them moved. The hunter's mind raced through possibilities. A bear with mange, a deformed deer, a guy in a costume, but each explanation crumbled under the weight of what he was seeing. Bears don't stand like that. Deer don't have claws. No costume could replicate the sickening wrongness of its proportions. The way its neck seemed to twist as it slowly, deliberately turned its head to keep him in its gaze. Its mouth opened slightly, revealing teeth that were too numerous, too sharp, arranged in a grin that held no warmth, only assessment. It was sizing him up, deciding if he was prey. The primal terror that seized him was unlike anything he'd ever felt. It was the fear of the caveman, the fear of being stalked by something that saw you as meat. His rifle, usually a comforting weight in his hands, felt useless. He didn't dare raise it, didn't dare make a sudden move. He took one step backward, then another. The creature's head tracked him, its eyes never leaving his face. He took another step, and another, moving slowly, deliberately, keeping his eyes locked on the thing in the shadows. He didn't turn his back. He couldn't. Every instinct screamed that the moment he looked away, it would pounce. He retreated for what felt like an eternity, moving backward down the trail, until a bend in the path finally blocked his view. Then he turned and ran. He ran faster than he'd ever run in his life, branches whipping his face, roots trying to trip him, his lungs burning with cold air and terror. He didn't stop until he reached his truck, threw his gear in the bed, and sped away, leaving a cloud of dust and a lifetime of certainty behind. A shared nightmare. Weeks later, still shaken, Inquisitor 4196 posted his story on an online forum, hoping for answers or at least validation. The responses were a mix of skepticism, ridicule, and a few terrified echoes. One reply, however, stood out. It was from a man who identified himself as being of Native American heritage, living near Sturgeon Lake, Minnesota, less than 50 miles from Willow River. He wrote that his experience happened around the same time, in the late fall of 2016. He was sitting on his back porch at dusk, enjoying the silence, when he felt a powerful urge to look toward the tree line at the edge of his property. Standing there, half hidden by the shadows, was a creature. He described it in almost identical terms: tall, emaciated, with matted fur and elongated limbs. It stood perfectly still, one long arm braced against a tree, its head cocked at an unnatural angle. Its eyes, dark and forward-facing, were fixed on his house. On him, the man said he felt a cold dread settle over him, a weight that made it hard to breathe. He didn't move. The creature didn't move. They simply stared at each other across the expanse of lawn as the last light faded from the sky. Finally, as darkness enveloped the woods, the creature simply turned and melted into the shadows. It didn't walk away. It was there, and then it wasn't, like smoke dissipating in the wind. The Native American man wrote that his grandfather had told him stories of such things: the Jin'maan, the Stick Indians, or other names his tribe had for the wild, hungry things that lived in the deep forest. They were not animals, his grandfather had said. They were something older, something that had been in these woods since before his people arrived. They were usually shy, avoiding humans, but sometimes, when they got hungry enough, or bold enough, they would come to the edge of the clearing and watch. They were learning, waiting, the unanswered questions. The two accounts, posted separately, hundreds of miles apart in the digital void, painted a terrifying picture. Something was stalking the woods of Minnesota, something that defied classification, that existed in the liminal space between folklore and reality. Inquisitor 4196 never went back to that part of the forest. He sold his hunting cabin and took up a different hobby, but he couldn't escape the memory of those dark, forward-facing eyes, watching him, assessing him. He often wondered, if he had raised his rifle, would the bullet have stopped it? Or would it have simply absorbed the impact and continued its slow, deliberate approach? And on cold, quiet nights, when the wind holds its breath and the woods fall silent, he still feels it. The weight of that gaze, the knowledge that somewhere out there, in the deep woods near Willow River, it's still watching. Still waiting. Still hungry. Story 3. The Bleached Grove and the Vanishing Photographer. The Solo Expedition. He was an explorer by nature, a man who found solace in solitude and purpose in the undocumented corners of the map. In the summer of 2018, he set out on a solo backpacking trip into a remote section of an unnamed national forest in the Pacific Northwest. His goal was simple: to hike off trail for 3 days, to see landscapes untouched by human hands, and to document his journey with his trusted analog camera. He was an experienced outdoorsman, well-versed in navigation, survival, and the subtle language of the wilderness. He was prepared for everything except what he found. On the second day, he pushed through a particularly dense section of old-growth forest where the trees were colossal, their trunks wider than his shoulders, their roots sprawling across the forest floor like the veins of a sleeping giant. The undergrowth was thick with ferns and devil's club, forcing him to constantly check his bearing. The air was heavy with the smell of damp earth and decaying vegetation. It was the smell of life and death intertwined. He noticed the change before he saw the clearing. The birds, which had been a constant background chorus, fell silent. The insects stopped buzzing. The only sound was the soft crush of his own footsteps on the duff. Then, the light changed. It became brighter, harsher, as if he were emerging from a tunnel. He stepped out of the trees and into a nightmare. The circle of ash. The clearing was roughly circular, maybe 50 yards in diameter, punched into the forest like a fist through paper. But it wasn't a normal clearing. It wasn't a meadow or a beaver pond or a patch of young growth. Everything inside that circle was dead. Not just dead, but bleached. The trees, which must have been centuries old, stood like skeletons. Their bark was gone, their wood weathered to a pale, ashy white. The undergrowth, ferns, bushes, saplings, was reduced to a fine, white powder that crunched under his boots. Even the dirt itself looked wrong, leached of color, pale and granular like bone meal. It was as if all the color, all the life, all the essence had been drained out of the ground and into some invisible void. The air was cold, not the cool shade of the forest, but a penetrating, damp chill that cut through his jacket and settled into his bones. And there was a smell. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but it was there beneath the sterile scent of ash and dust. It was the smell of decay, but wrong, sweet and cloying, like rotting flowers mixed with something metallic, like blood. He stood at the edge, his heart pounding, every instinct screaming at him to turn around, to go back the way he came. But he was a documentarian. He had to see, he had to understand. He stepped into the circle. The moment his foot touched the pale earth, the sensation of being watched intensified 100-fold. It wasn't a vague feeling, it was a certainty. There were eyes on him. Not human eyes, and not animal eyes. Something else, something that regarded him with an ancient, patient malevolence. He later described it as the feeling of being watched by very unkind eyes. He forced himself to move forward, his camera clutched in his hands like a talisman. In the center of the clearing, he found a depression, a shallow crater, about 10 feet across, as if something had impacted here long ago and the ground had never healed. The soil in the crater was darker, almost black, and it seemed to pulse with a faint, sickly warmth. He raised his camera. He framed his shots carefully. The bleached trees against the too bright sky, the crater's dark heart, the impossible whiteness of the ground. He shot an entire roll of film, the click of the shutter the only sound in the dead silence. He didn't dare linger. As soon as the roll was finished, he turned and walked, then jogged, then ran out of the clearing, crashing back into the green, living forest beyond its border. The moment he was back among the normal trees, the feeling of being watched vanished. But the chill remained. The sickness. He made camp that night far from the clearing, but he couldn't shake the unease. He felt cold, despite the fire. He felt tired, despite not having exerted himself much. He barely slept, his dreams filled with images of white trees and dark, watching eyes. The next morning, he broke camp early and began the long hike back to the ranger station. As he walked, the unease grew into something physical. His stomach began to churn, twisting into painful knots. A cold sweat broke out on his forehead. His vision blurred at the edges. He pushed on, driven by a desperate need to get out of the woods. About a mile from the ranger station, his body gave out. A wave of nausea so powerful it dropped him to his knees swept over him. He vomited violently, painfully, retching until there was nothing left but dry heaves. He lay on the trail, shaking and weak, until he could gather the strength to crawl the final distance to the station. The rangers took one look at him and called an ambulance. At the hospital, he was diagnosed with a severe viral infection. He had a high fever, his white blood cell count was dangerously low, and his kidneys were showing signs of stress. He was admitted immediately and spent 3 days in a hospital bed, pumped full of fluids and antibiotics, slowly recovering. When the worst of the sickness passed, the doctors asked him what had happened. Had he drunk from a stream? Eaten anything unusual? Been bitten by a tick? He said no to all of it, but he didn't tell them about the clearing. He didn't tell them about the bleached trees and the dark crater and the feeling of being watched by unkind eyes. He was afraid they would think he was crazy. The blank frames. After he was discharged, he drove home, still weak, still haunted. He had one thing left to do: develop the film from his camera. He needed to see the evidence, to prove to himself that the clearing was real. He set up his darkroom, a familiar and comforting ritual. He loaded the film into the developing tank, added the chemicals, and waited. When the time came to hang the negatives to dry, his heart sank. They were blank, all of them. The entire roll of film that he had shot in the clearing was pure, unexposed white. No images, no detail, nothing. He checked his camera. It was working perfectly. He developed the film again, thinking he'd made a mistake. The result was the same. Every single frame he had taken inside that circle of ash was blank. The forest outside the clearing, the photos he'd taken before and after, developed perfectly. But the clearing itself refused to be captured. It was as if the place had rejected the light, rejected the chemistry, rejected the very act of documentation. It wanted to remain hidden. The lingering shadow. Years later, the photographer still carries the mark of that place. He suffers from chronic headaches that come and go without warning. His stomach, once iron strong, is now prone to strange sensitivities and sudden bouts of pain. He sees specialists, but they can find no physical cause. They call it psychosomatic, a stress response to a traumatic event. But he knows the truth. He knows that something in that clearing infected him, not with a virus, but with something else. A residue, a stain, a piece of that bleached, dead place that lodged itself in his cells and refuses to leave. He knows that the feeling of being watched never really left him. It's always there, at the edge of his awareness, a cold weight at the back of his mind. He never went back to that forest. He warns anyone who will listen to stay on the marked trails, to never venture into the deep, unmapped places. Because there are things in the woods that don't want to be found. There are places where the earth itself is sick, where the light doesn't behave, where unkind eyes watch from the shadows. And if you stumble into one of those places, you might escape with your life. But a part of you will stay there forever, bleached and cold, in the heart of the grove. You will see the full video. Please subscribe the channel.